Hello students, this is Dr. Ways and welcome to your lecture on the ankle and the foot. So this overview of the ankle and foot shows the plantar aspect of the foot, in other words the most inferior portion of the foot, and the blue outlines represent the spots where your foot comes in contact with the ground. So that suggests that not all parts of your foot are actually going to be touching the ground, and the reason for that are the arches in the foot, which we'll see in the next slide. All right, so another thing to point out in this, couple things. One, the medial malleolus, lateral malleolus, of course, which would represent the bumps on your ankle that you see on the medial and lateral side. Always know that the medial malleolus of the tibia is associated with the first phalange, or the first digit of the foot, and the lateral is always with the fifth digit of the foot. And also that you have two sesamoid bones on the distal end of the metatarsal of the first digit. And the sesamoid bones, your patella is also a sesamoid bone, are often formed within tendons under areas that have a lot of tension. So the sesamoid bones underneath on the inferior side of the great toe indicate that area is a site where a lot of tension is generated. All right, so you already knew our feet are not flat. On the medial border, we have this medial longitudinal arch. All right, and I don't care about the degrees and how big that arch should be, but if you get into musculoskeletal stuff for your career, then that would be a good place where you'll start knowing that in detail. We also have our lateral longitudinal arch. So given that picture that we showed before, there's less of our medial foot that's actually touching the ground and more of our lateral foot that's touching the ground, but there's still a good part of it that doesn't really touch the ground. And then we have our transverse arch over here, which is going from digit 1 all the way to digit 5. So it almost looks like our foot is kind of in a bound position so that it is arched ready for movement. In fact, these kind of act like a buffer against forces generated by your leg muscles as they push against the ground. So instead of having flat feet, which would generate almost no force and be very tough on your joints, you have this malleable these malleable arches that can provide that buffer and allow the release of mechanical energy. So to keep our feet in this arched position, we have certain tendons which help out. For example, the fibularis longus tendon, which we discussed previously, goes from the lateral part of the foot and inserts medially, and that forces the medial side of your foot inward a little bit, helping to form that transverse arch. And then we have these ligaments from the calcaneus all the way to the digits, and then from the calcaneus to the metatarsals that will help support and maintain that medial longitudinal arch. And again, I don't care that you know the names of these tendons, but I want you to understand why they're there and how they help support these arches. So along the foot and ankle, we have these fibrous bands of fascia that are attached to bones, and their job is to hold tendons in place. And these fibrous bands of fascia are called the retinacula, or retinaculum singular. So anywhere that there's a potential for a tendon to slip out of place or be directed in a certain direction, you're going to find these retinacula that will help hold those tendons in place so that they don't slip and compromise the function of the muscles that those tendons are attached to. And so you have these superior and inferior fibular retinacula, which hold the tendons of the fibularis longus and fibularis brevis in place as they curve around the fibula into their insertion points on the first digit and the fifth digit. And then on the anterior portion of the foot, we have our superior extensor retinaculum. Remember, the anterior compartment of the foot is our extensor muscles, dorsiflexion. Excuse me. And so the superior is between the tibia and fibula, holding the tendons in place up there. And then we have the inferior extensor retinaculum, which branches into a superior part that is attached to the tibia and an inferior part that is attached to the medial aspect of the foot. And so if you notice, it's holding the tendons here from the EDL, from the extensor hallucis longus, as well as the tibialis anterior in place. And then medially, you have this flexor retinaculum here, and that is probably going to be one of your more important ones because of what you see going through there. Not only do you have the tendon of the flexor digitorum longus, the tibialis posterior, and the flexor hallucis longus going through there, but you also have an artery, vein, and a nerve going through there, the tibial nerve, the posterior tibial artery, and the tibial vein. All right, so, this is not just to hold tendons in place, but it's also to hold these blood vessels and nerves in place. And another important part of this is notice it's right just posterior to the medial malleolus. And so this artery, this tibial artery, posterior tibial artery, is one of the places that we're going to check, or you're going to check in physical exam lab for a pulse. The other one in the foot being on the dorsal portion of the foot. And we'll talk about that more later when we get on with that part of the foot. So this posterior tibial artery, if you put your fingers, of course the tibia is medial and the medial malleolus is medial, so you put your fingers just posterior to that medial malleolus, feel a pulse, and then you can assess the circulation going to the foot by that method. So there are a lot of foot muscles, little foot muscles that are present, and I don't want you to know every single one, especially where the origin insertion is, but I want you to have a general idea about, if a foot muscle is located in a certain spot, what function is that going to have for the foot? So what I want you to notice about these first two, the extensor hallucis brevis and the extensor digitorum brevis, you've seen these names before, only the muscles were up here in the anterior compartment of the thigh, the extensor hallucis longus and the extensor digitorum longus. But now they're shorter muscles and they are contained to solely within the foot, and they would provide the same function that those longest muscles do, which would be extension of toe 1 for the hallucis and extension of toes 2 through 4 at the brevis. Notice that 5 is not included with here. That's only with the extensor digitorum longus. And then just like the muscles of the anterior compartment of the leg, these are innervated by the deep fibular nerve. The other thing I want you to notice about this is when you have these retinacula that are holding tendons in place, more often than not, you will see these synovial sheaths that are covering the tendons as well. So remember, synovial joints are joints that have that are well lubricated, and so think of these as like lubricating sacs that the tendon is sliding through, so that you can maintain joint flexibility as the muscles are pulling on those tendons. On the plantar side of the foot, you have another arrangement of muscles. So the muscles on the plantar side, of course, are mostly going to be things that will allow for flexion of the toes and the foot itself. Or if you're looking at them attached to the medial or lateral aspects of the toes, they'll be responsible for a deduction or a abduction. So the names kind of tell you what they do. The abductor hallucis, it abducts, so it takes your big toe away from the midline. So that would be this right here, the abductor hallucis. So it would take your toe away from the midline. And here, the midline is not the midline of your body, it's the midline of your foot. So it's taking the toe in this direction. The abductor digiti minimi would be on the other side. And notice that's attached to toe 5. So it would take your toe, abduct it away from the midline of the foot in this direction. So what that kind of tells you with the foot, and it's going to be the same way with the hands, is that abduction and adduction is in reference to the midline of that particular appendage, whether it be a foot or a hand, rather than to the whole body, as we were used to talking about abduction and adduction. All right, then right in the middle, you have your flexor digitorum brevis, which goes to toes 2, 3, 4, and 5, and they're going to be involved in flexing our toes, so down towards the ground. And these muscles are innervated by the medial and lateral plantar nerves, and those are branches coming off of the tibial nerve. So layer 2 then is going to be a little bit deeper than layer 1, or if you will, a more superior than layer 1. So they're going to be closer to the bone. And we have our quadratus plantae right here. And notice it's a quadrilateral shaped muscle, so hence the name. And the lumbricals. All right, lumbricals means little worms. So these are like little worm-like muscles that are between toe 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, and 4 and 5. So the quadratus plantae, also known as the flexor accessoris, is an accessory muscle, because notice that it inserts into the flexor digitorum longus muscle. So it's going to help the flexum digitorum longus muscle do its job, which is flexion of the distal phalanx of toes 2 through 5. Lateral plantar nerve is this innervation. And then the lumbricals, notice that they are on the sides of each toe between the toes, and their job is going to be flexion of the proximal phalanx of toes 2 through 5. So more of a flexion near the base of the toes rather than specifically at the ends of the toes. And for our purposes, that distinction is not really that important. Innervation, lateral plantar nerve. All right, layer 3, more deep, or if you will, more superior, or third way to talk about it, more towards the actual bones of the foot. We have our flexor hallucis brevis. So that's it right here. And notice there are 2 insertion points into the sesamoid bones of the great toe. And so, again, flexor hallucis, short muscle that flexes the toe near its joint with the metatarsal, the first metatarsal. And then we have the adductor hallucis, which has 2 different heads to it as well. This large one right here that goes into a oblique angle, and then these transverse ones that go obviously at a transverse angle from the first toe to toes 2 through 5. So in red here would be the origins of these muscles, and the insertion point would be on the first toe. And so what it's going to do is it's going to pull the toe back towards the midline, which we've already defined as a deduction. So this would oppose our abductor muscles of the great toe. And then the third muscle of the layer 3 that we want to cover is the flexor digiti minimi brevis. All right, so notice if it says digiti minimi, that usually means it's attached to the fifth digit. And so this one is no different. Its origin is here on the foot, on the cuboid, and then its insertion point is into the joint between the metatarsal and the phalange. And its job is going to be flexion of toe 5. All right, so more flexing towards the ground. All right, so the fourth layer, the last layer of the muscles of the plantar region. For this slide or for this picture, what I want to show you here is this. They're showing you in a picture, if you've forgotten, that abduction and adduction in the foot refers to moving away from the midline of the foot. And to be a little more specific, it's away. We use toe 2 as the midline. So abduction away from toe 2 of the first toe right here, and then abduction of the toes 3, 4, and 5 away from the second toe. All right, and then when we add them back, a deduction, of course, that would be going back towards the midline. All right, so what are the muscles here? Well, we have our dorsal interosseous muscle right here, dorsal interosseous, and notice it's first, so that implies there's a second, third, and fourth dorsal interosseous muscle. So their job is going to be abduction of toes 2 through 4, taking them away, and flexion of toes 2 through 4, but to a lesser extent because these aren't going to have as much power as those other flexor muscles that we mentioned previously. And then we have our plantar interossei muscles, first, second, and third plantar. So there are only 3 of those, and their job is a deduction, so bringing the toes back to the midline of toes 3 through 5, as well as some flexion, but the flexion part's going to be weak, so their main job is a deduction. All right, and being interossei muscles between bones. All right, so interossei tells you exactly where they're located in between bones. And then dorsal, of course, would mean those that are more on the dorsal side of the foot, and plantar means that they are more on the plantar side of the foot. As far as the nerves go to the foot and ankle, we've already mentioned that the tibial nerve coming here around the flexor retinaculum will divide into our medial plantar nerve and our lateral plantar nerve. Of course, medial is going to be going more towards the great toe, whereas lateral is going to be going more towards the fifth toe. And we saw all the muscles in which the lateral innervated and which the medial is innervated. And so that was the motor function of these nerves. But the sensory function is shown right here in the picture of cutaneous innervation. So the medial plantar nerve, goes from toe 1, 2, 3, and half of toe 4, whereas the lateral plantar nerve would go about midfoot to toe 5 and half of toe 4. We have our sural nerve, innervating the lateral aspect of our foot, and a saphenous nerve, medial aspect of our foot. That's where we get, again, cutaneous sensation. And the tibial nerve would be the heel of our foot. Again, this is all sensory right here as opposed to motor, which we've covered in the previous slides. All right, looking at the dorsal side of the foot, here's the saphenous nerve. Okay, we talked about that being along the medial side of the foot, but notice that it's also the medial ankle. And the saphenous nerve is a branch of the femoral nerve and going down to the foot and ankle. The superficial fibular nerve, notice, is strictly on the dorsum of the foot, running from lateral to medial. So it's going to go to toes, half of toe 1, half of toe 2, all of toe 3, 4, and half of toe 5, which it would share with the sural nerve for the rest of toe 5 in a lateral foot. And then a deep fibular nerve would run up here into the in between toes 1 and 2, again providing cutaneous sensation. And then also notice that the medial plantar nerve also innervates the dorsal surface of each toe, so it wraps all the way around the plantar side of the foot to the dorsal side of the foot, and where each toe ends, where the nail of each toe would end. All right, for the arteries that supply our foot, they are, for the dorsal side, it's going to come from the anterior tibial artery, and then that is going to branch into a lot of ostomoses around the ankle, as well as to the dorsalis pedis artery. And this is another important artery for you to know, this dorsalis pedis, because that is the second point at which you can take a pulse of the foot. So if you want a indication of the blood supply to the plantar side of the foot, you would pick the tibialis posterior artery. But if you want a indication of the perfusion to the dorsal side of the foot, you would assess the dorsalis pedis artery, and that would be right here between the first toe and the second toe, about midway up the foot. And it will take some practice to identify where it is, but once you've done it in a few people, you'll get a pretty good idea of where you need to place your hands to be able to feel this pulse. All right, so looking over here with the posterior tibial artery, that's going to divide into our medial plantar artery and our lateral plantar artery. That should look very familiar to you because that's the same route that the tibial nerve took. And then what I want you to notice is that the lateral plantar artery then divides into this deep plantar arch. All right, so this plantar arch that goes around and supplies our deep interossei muscles with the blood. And I did forget to mention that over on the dorsal side, we have this arcuate artery that goes around and will supply the dorsal side of our muscles in between each toe with blood as well. So you have this extensive redundant system of blood flow in the foot that makes sure that, again, like we've seen elsewhere, that blood flow remains to the foot in multiple spots. So if one spot gets cut off by injury, by compression, just the way you're sitting or standing, then other pathways can still supply blood to the areas that were cut off. The veins that drain your foot come from all these, and again, don't care that you know the names of them, that are coming from the digits, and then they drain into this dorsal venous arch. So it's this collection point from all areas of the foot that run up and become the great saphenous vein on the medial side and the small saphenous vein on the lateral side. And of course, remember the great saphenous vein runs all the way up the anterior superficially of the thigh and goes into the saphenous opening within the femoral triangle. And then the small saphenous vein is going to run up the posterior portion of the leg superficially, where it will join with the popliteal vein.